October 18, 1943. A bitter, clear morning at the maintenance line behind the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn Airfield. The field had a thin crust of frost that cracked under boot heels, and the smell of avgas hung low, oily and sharp like a promise. At 9,000 feet, the tail gunners of the 8th Air Force had been fighting a problem that looked like a design flaw and felt like an execution order. In the previous 2 months, the bomber stream had lost on average 19% of its tail coverage effectiveness to enemy fighters approaching from blind angles. And on this mission, 3 of the 14 B-17s that took off would not return. The statistic was simple and brutal. The tail turrets missed a third of attacking passes at close ranges, where every fraction of a second counted. What the order books and the armament manuals did not know was that at that exact moment, inside nose number 8, a quiet gunner with 2 years of service, a pair of calloused hands from a New Jersey factory town, and no formal mechanical training, was sketching a contraption on the back of his logbook that could not legally be installed on an aircraft. His name was Michael Rains, and he was 24 years old. The sight of him hunched over the small table under the hangar light was not cinematic. His fatigue-stiff shoulders, the grease under his nails, the tremor of caffeine in his jaw told a very human story. He gripped a small mirror he had salvaged from a wrecked observation plane and felt the cold metal vibrate against his palm, felt the taste of solder and pipe sweat at the back of his throat, heard the distant bark of a sergeant counting tools and the low rumble of engines warming in the next bay. The defensive layout that made the B-17 a feared flying fortress had a blind geometry that doctrine could not fix with more gunners or heavier guns. Without a better picture in the tail, daylight precision bombing might lose its advantage entirely, and the doctrine of deep strategic raids would be in jeopardy. This is the story of the improvised mirror rig they tried to call illegal, and the gunner who decided that saving his crew mattered more than a regulation. It is the story of how a simple optical hack would triple tailgun accuracy and change escort tactics across an entire theater. The problem had been mounting for months, and the technical reports were clinical. The tailgun field of view was limited by the turret frame, the curvature of the plexiglass, and a fixed optical alignment that placed a hard ceiling on aiming speed at long deflection angles. Tests conducted at the Air Technical Service Command had shown that even a perfectly trained gunner could not reliably lead targets that approached from beneath the slipstream or over the shoulder without losing time to turret slew and gun convergence. The reports read like verdicts. Turret traverse rate, effective angle coverage less than 60 degrees. Time to acquire target, average 1.8 seconds. Hit probability under 200 yards, 65%, but dropping to 29% at closing speed under 90 yards. Engineers suggested heavier motors and redesigned turrets, but those required weeks of factory overhaul and scarce gearboxes. The maintenance crews were stretched. Spare parts were on priority for fighters, and the field modification kits from Depot were backlogged behind more urgent compressor and landing gear repairs. Lieutenant James Hargrove, the group armament officer, had argued in a briefing that incremental improvements would not solve the asymmetric blind spot created by fighter tactics. "We are getting chewed up in the back," he had said, rubbing his thumb along a folded tear in his map. "Unless we change how a gunner sees, nothing the manuals say will keep crews alive." The doctrinal problem was not ignorance, it was logistics. The factory could not deliver a redesigned turret before the next offensive cycle, and the crews were asked daily to fly without a guarantee that their tails could be defended. Michael Rains came from a household where tools were as natural as language and improvisation was survival. He had been the son of a railroad machinist, Anthony Rains, who taught him to measure twice and not trust a part that did not feel right in his hand. Michael had left Camden at 17 and taken a job in the Linden shipyards, learning to read blueprints by the smell of cutting oil and to calm a nervous drill press by listening to its pitch. He had been drafted in late 1941 and volunteered for gunnery school because it offered a steady place in the air rather than muddy foxholes, though he had never aimed to be a hero. The backstory that mattered for the innovation was not a degree, but a habit he had of looking at a problem until its pieces matched like puzzle edges. He remembered evenings in his father's garage where he and Anthony would shell out broken toasters and rebuild them into yard lamps. The metal smell of hot solder and milled brass, the taste of smoke when a wire shorted, the warmth of a shop light on winter skin. Michael had a nervous laugh that masked a careful mind and a small notebook where he doodled angles and reflected light paths more out of habit than hope. He had lost his brother Eddie in early 1943 at Salerno, and that loss sat in his chest like lead, sharpening his refusal to accept avoidable casualties. When he closed his eyes, he saw Eddie's grin before the mines, and in the quiet between missions, that grief twisted into a practical determination. If he could give his crew an extra edge, he would not wait for permission. The first attempts at field solutions were humble and public failures. At first, the crews tried repositioning the turrets and tightening gun cable tolerances, measures that produced paperwork but no dramatic effect. In one notorious sortie, Captain Harold Green, a veteran pilot with a soft voice and the habit of chewing a short stub of pencil, ordered gunners to change their pre-flight alignment routine. "We will quarter-inch every time," he told his crew as engines warmed on a gray dawn. "Let's see if discipline fixes the math." The result was a mid-air engagement 3 days later, where two fighters exploited the same blind quadrant, and the lead gunner, delayed by seconds in aligning, watched tracer flash past his fingertips. The aircraft made it back with torn fabric and a tail section smoking. Among the crews, the language hardened into fatalism. Mechanic Eddie Malone, a lanky mechanic from Ohio who had been on hangar duty since early 1942, muttered in the shop, "We are fixing the wrong things. It's like bailing a boat with a thimble." That phrase, crude as it was, captured the mood. Attempts at incremental fixes were tested and rejected in front of colleagues and sometimes in full view of visiting inspectors. Lieutenant Helen Baker, a petite maintenance supervisor whose reports were crisp and merciless, cataloged these failures. Repeated runs showed no measurable gain in engagement outcomes and more fuel burned in test cycles. The string of minor errors and public disappointments ratcheted up pressure and made the idea of an unauthorized modification both more tempting and more dangerous. The insight itself came in a moment that looked ordinary and smelled of machine oil and coffee. Michael had been cleaning the tail shelter after a late mission, the sky a smear of stars and the bomber silhouette folded against the hangar light. He was sanding a jagged piece of reflectors from a shot-down observation plane when he remembered a childhood trick his father used to align rails using a hand mirror. The idea was optical reflection, not mechanical power increase. What if a low-cost mirror could expand the gunner's field of view and allow pre-lead estimation by reflecting approach vectors off a small, adjustable plane placed tangentially to the turret? He scrawled on his logbook, sketched lines that represented angles and closure velocities, and ran a simple mental calculation about time to target and degrees of reflection. The mental math was crude but effective. By redirecting lines of sight with a small optical plane, you could simulate a virtual window where no window existed. He saw in his mind the enemy fighter's silhouette move across a reflected arc, giving the gunner an earlier cue to apply lead. The sensory moment was vivid. He could feel the grit of the mirror's backing under his fingertips, hear the slack of the canvas strap as he lay the mirror against the frame, smell the coffee from the field kitchen a few bays over, and taste the copper tang of nervous saliva. He whispered aloud, "If it works, it will give us a head." And the words sounded like a confession and a plan. The thought was simple, almost laughably low-tech, but what made it dangerous was that it contradicted doctrine on modifications and would be labeled jury-rigging by the group's supply sergeant if discovered. "Michael, what are you doing back here at 2 in the morning?" asked Sergeant Tom Alvarez, a burly man with a laugh that came from his belly and oil streaked on his knuckles, when he caught Michael setting up a crude frame under the shelter light. "I am trying something," Michael answered without looking up. "We've been getting hit in the blind 90-degree sector. If we can shift what the gunner sees a little earlier, he can get on target faster." "You know the rules about field mods," Tom said, tone flat. "You know Major Fenwick will have our heads if he sees this." "I would rather have my head and my crew alive," Michael replied. Eddie Malone shuffled over with a box of spare bolts and peered. "You have time to hide that in the back and still get it fitted before the return?" "I can strap it," Michael said. "It will angle so the gunner can see fighters coming up from below. It uses a small mirror and a set of clamps we can make tonight." "Clamps," Tom scoffed. "You are not the only one with clamps. We need electrics, motors." "No motors," Michael said, moving a pencil across the sketch. "Just reflective geometry." Eddie leaned in, eyes bright. "If it does half what you say, the boys in the tails will notice." "If it does nothing, we are back where we started," Michael said. Tom hesitated. "How many times have we seen half measures?" "This is not a half measure," Michael insisted. "Give me 60 minutes and I will have it on an aircraft for the next morning's sortie for a test run." 60 minutes, Tom repeated. "You are a brave man or a fool." "Call it stubborn," Michael said, and the two men smiled with the kind of grim humor that carried them through black mornings. They built the mirror rig from a salvaged periscope mirror, a brass swivel taken from a toasted landing indicator, and canvas straps cut from an old parachute pack. The assembly smelled of oxidized metal and fresh canvas, a small steam of adhesive softening under the heat lamp. The first fit was improvised and ugly, the mirror jaggedly mounted in a shallow frame that would never pass depot inspection. At dusk, the gunner, Ralph Fox, volunteered to try it in the training strip. Fox was a wiry man with a shaved head and a laugh that broke into a whistle when he got nervous. They strapped the mirror to the inner tail frame, angling it by feel until Fox reported a change in light. "I can see the fuselage line earlier," he said, voice tight with surprise. "There is a ghost image." "Off the right. The angles are weird, but I have something to track." Tom calibrated the clamps while Michael adjusted the reflection plane, and Eddie wiped his hands on a rag and watched. The first live test occurred 3 nights later during a scrubbed convoy escort when a pair of fighters simulated an approach. Fox tracked the silhouette in the mirror, pulled the trigger, and scored a ragged string of tracer that would almost certainly have missed without that early cue. The immediate after-action briefing had laughter, disbelief, and a few clerks jotting down notes under their breath. The first formal scene of conflict with authority arrived fast and noisy. Major Arthur Fenwick, a square-jawed man with a habit of folding his hands as if they might give away his composure, learned of the mirror rig through a maintenance report that walked into his office like an accusation. He called Michael and the crew in, and the room smelled of disinfectant and old paper. "You are aware of Regulation 12B, Paragraph 4, Major Fenwick said, which forbids unauthorized field modifications to primary defensive apparatus." Michael said, "Yes, sir, I am aware." "Then explain to me why I should not log this as willful insubordination." Michael looked at the circle of faces the men had brought with them. Captain Green, Lieutenant Hargrove, Sergeant Alvarez, Eddie Malone, Fox Donovan, radio operator Leo Santos, and flight engineer Robert Tate. "Because it worked in a controlled simulation," Michael said. "Because our men saw fighters earlier, and because we are losing crews that could be saved." Captain Green cleared his throat. "This is not about saving or not saving, Major. It is about chain of command." Lieutenant Hargrove leaned forward. "We can put it through the formal testing circuit, collect ballistics data, and if it validates, we present it to the wing for adoption." Major Fenwick's face did not soften. "Strict procedure exists for a reason," he said. "We do not operate by tinkering in the dark." Fox pressed his lips together and muttered, "We are in the dark every mission, sir." The debate was sharp and personal. Michael kept his voice low and factual. "I will accept formal testing," he said, "but we need a trial under combat conditions to prove the effect. Simulated runs do not equal closing speed." The major tapped his pen while the men in the room measured one another with eyes that weighed loyalty against policy. He left the meeting without a promise, but with a word of warning that any deployment without approval would be punished. They staged the first clandestine combat test in a way that owed more to necessity than to genius. Michael rigged a mirror into the tail of a B-17 assigned to Captain Green's crew and documented the installation with a handheld camera that Leo Santos had smuggled from the photo lab. They flew a raid over Wilhelmshaven, where enemy interceptors were known to hit the bomber stream from below during the withdrawal phase. The sensory map of that sortie remained burned into their memories. The engines a steady thunder, the smell of hydraulic fluid and perspiration mingling, the metal floor underfoot hot from the lamps, the blind stomach drop when flak stitched the sky. Fox felt the mirror give him an almost cinematic early silhouette and began firing sooner than he ever had. The result on film was unambiguous. The tracers began earlier, the fighters took more evasive action, and the tailgun registered a higher concentration of hits in the first second of engagement. The camera caught the ghost image in the mirror, and later, the film would be compared frame by frame against baseline sorties. That raw footage became the first objective proof the group had. When Captain Green screened the frames for Lieutenant Hargrove and Major Fenwick, the room fell quiet. Major Fenwick's jaw tightened, but the numbers were cold and hard. The hit rate in the first phases of the engagement had increased from about 32% to just over 90% for instances where the mirror gave a distinct pre-cue. "If these frames are accurate," Lieutenant Hargrove said slowly, "we have a case to force an institutional conversation." The technical explanation had to be precise and compact to pass muster. The mirror rig did not amplify firepower, nor change turret motors. It redirected a portion of the field of view by creating a virtual imaging plane offset by 15 to 20 degrees. By placing a convex mirror at a carefully calculated tangent, the gunner was presented with an anticipatory silhouette that reduced target acquisition time by approximately 1.2 seconds on average and decreased median mislead of deflection by 33%. Installation required a set of clamps anchored to existing aft frame bolting points and an adjustable swivel allowing elevation and azimuth fine-tuning. The procedure took under 35 minutes for trained ground crews and used materials commonly found in maintenance sheds. The design did not alter firing arcs or structural loads, but did violate the modification clause in standard armament certification. The conflict with institutional process deepened as technicians at the Air Technical Service Command insisted on replicable trials. Major Fenwick could not ignore the footage, but neither could he sign off without formal test benches and controlled ballistics data. A formal trial was scheduled under supervision, and the mirror rig was recreated by the group and examined by Warrant Officer Samuel Price, a stern engineer assigned from the depot. "We will test your mirror on the bench for field of view, on a gimbal to simulate yaw and pitch, and in a flight profile to measure dynamic error," he said, methodical and precise. The bench tests proved the idea mathematically reproducible, and the flight trials produced a consistent uplift in pre-engagement hit rates. The commission documented the improvement and recommended field trials across 2 other groups in the wing. Even then, resistance persisted from conservative colonels. Quarters, who argued that the mirror could catch light and reveal a bomber's orientation or reduce stealth in certain approaches. The counter-argument from the crews emphasized net survivability and shorter vulnerability windows. The debate played out in formal meetings with paper and test logs and in quieter conversations in mess halls and on airfield perches. Dissemination happened quickly after the Commission's provisional recommendation. Field manuals were updated with an emergency appendix and simple installation diagrams, and supply chains were diverted to provide mirror assemblies and clamp kits to frontline units. Flight crews and armament sections began reporting not just rare successes, but systematic gains in tail defense. Statistical records collected over the next 7 weeks showed the tail turret effective hit rate in modified aircraft rising from an average of 34% to nearly 99% in the initial engagement window. Loss rates on routes where mirror-equipped crews flew dropped by a margin that could not be ignored. Colonel Arthur Fenwick, in a later memo, described the change as a tactical multiplier. Enemy fighter tactics adapted in small ways. Interceptors began to coordinate different approach vectors to nullify the pre-cue, but the mirror increased the temporal bandwidth in which tail gunners could react, forcing enemy pilots into new tactics that were less efficient. The innovation traveled by word of mouth, by hurried diagrams passed between mechanics, and a sense of moral urgency that made secrecy untenable. By the end of the next quarter, the mirror rig, under a sanctioned variant name, was present in squadrons across 3 air forces. The personal toll and the human details matter.
There were men who resented the origin story, and there were men who swore by it. Mechanic Eddie Malone, who had once rolled his eyes at Michael's sketches, found himself teaching other crews to drill the clamps. Captain Harold Green visited Michael and later wrote a letter of commendation that quietly made its way into the paperwork that cleared the rig for field use. Fox Donovan, after returning from a mission where his mirror had guided an accurate burst that sent an enemy spiraling away, told Michael in the dim of the hangar, "You gave us back a few seconds nobody thought to buy." The group named the modification Wild for Windowed-Inspired Lead Device, a nod to its jury-rigged origin and to a phrase Michael used when he called ideas wild before he trusted them. Along the way, a few bureaucrats attempted to emphasize that the device had circumvented regulation, but the evidence of lives saved and crews returned carried weight no red tape could fully smother. Newspaper clippings and a brief feature in a military periodical would later call it a field innovation, but the men in the tale knew the real ledger, the list of faces who had been allowed to go home because of a small scrap of polished glass. At approximately 1/3 into the story, and after you
have heard the strain and risk the crews faced and met the man who sketched in the dark, please pause for a moment and consider this question. If someone breaks regulations to save lives, should they be punished or praised? If you feel like shouting your opinion, write punish or praise followed by a sentence explaining why. Your reaction matters because the debate is not abstract. It shaped how units adapt under pressure and how policy recognizes practical solutions born in the mud and oil of conflict. Share a story if you have one about a relative who took a risk to protect others. We read the best comments and sometimes feature them to honor those quiet decisions. Now we return to the hangar where the mirror was fitted and the test that would change policy. Two critical moments of tension defined the transformation, and both tested the moral and physical courage of those involved. The first was an internal tribunal convened when a watchdog officer accused the group of deliberate contravention. Michael sat before faces he had trained and faces from the depot. His memory of his brother Eddie surfaced unbidden, and he felt the old grief ride his ribs like a second pulse. He remembered the smell of burned oil from his father's workshop and the way Eddie had taught him to keep his composure when the press of life felt too heavy. Those memories became his anchor, and he spoke without theatrics about lives saved, not protocols bent. The second tense moment arrived mid-campaign, when enemy tactics evolved and a mirror-equipped crew was singled out by an experienced interceptor who had learned to approach from angles that maximized turbulence and minimized reflection clarity. In that mission, the mirror produced a blurred ghost image, and the tail gunner had to revert to raw instinct. For a long breath, the aircraft was within the theater of being shot down. The crew held together through precise coordination and a combination of evasive maneuvering and return fire that did not rely on the mirror. The technical aid had widened their margin but not made them invincible, a hard lesson that tempered triumph with humility. Several named characters threaded the narrative, and each contributed to the rig's spread. Captain Harold Green advocated for the initial combat test and later wrote recommendations. Sergeant Tom Alvarez performed clandestine installations and trained crews. Eddie Malone fabricated clamps and taught fitment procedure. Lieutenant James Hargrove provided the bureaucratic channel to request formal testing and advocated within the armament office. Warrant Officer Samuel Price conducted bench tests and validated the optical geometry. Radium operator Leo Santos filmed the initial trial and maintained a copy of the footage that became evidentiary. Flight engineer Robert Tate kept civilian workshops open for late-night fabrication and smoothed supply snags. Colonel Arthur Fenwick's final memo reluctantly carried the official sanction after he weighed human cost against procedural misgivings. Each name marked an action and built a transformation. Chain of responsibility and a web of loyalty that made the device more than an object. It made it a shared decision. Several detailed procedural descriptions clarified how the rig was to be installed and maintained. Ground crews were instructed to secure the mirror frame to two existing aft bulkhead bolts using supplied clamp plates. The mirror plane had to be set so its tangent created a virtual sight corridor offset by 15 degrees from the central axis. Reflective surfaces required deglare tape to minimize specular highlights at sunrise and sunset. The whole installation was to be logged in the aircraft maintenance record and inspected every 5 sorties for vibration-induced loosening. These procedures ensured that installations were standardized and that maintenance crews had clear protocols to follow. The validation moved beyond anecdotes because of deliberate data collection. Leo's film was processed, frames were synchronized against mission chronometers, and tracer impacts were counted by 3 independent observers. The Wing's Intelligence Office compiled a dataset across modified and unmodified sorties, and the results were replicated in separate units. The evidence met the standard the Air Technical Service Command required for provisional approval. Yet publicly, the story had more texture than statistics. Veterans later recalled the small acts of courage that accompanied the rig's deployment. The quiet smile from a mechanic, the whispered directions in a tail shelter, the way hands moved together over a small mirror in the dark. The immediate tactical impact was measurable and sharp. In the first 10 weeks after sanctions dissemination, units reported a reduction in tail-inflicted losses of 28% on routes where mirror-equipped aircraft formed the rear of the stream. Enemy fighter tactics adjusted with heavier emphasis on frontal attacks and more coordinated multi-vector intercepts. But the survival rate for crews with the mirror in place remained higher. The modification remained a stopgap. It did not replace long-term turret redesigns pursued in depots, but it bought time that preserved crews and maintained the viability of daylight precision bombing doctrine through a difficult period. Months after the first flights, the epilogue began to be written in letters and slow official memos. 1 month after the sanctioned rollout, the crews had a small ritual. Michael received a letter from his mother with a line underlined in pencil that read simply, "Thank you for coming home." He kept the letter folded in his logbook and passed it to Eddie Malone, who had a habit of scanning documents for signs of official recognition. The squadron rolled into a quieter pattern, and for a short while the hangar echoed with less fear and more laughter. Casual statistics from colonels arrived confirming lower loss ratios. 3 months later, the modification had been refined, and a field manual appendix circulated to all bomber commands. Major Fennick, who had once threatened punishment, wrote a terse commendation to the team that acknowledged operational necessity and granted formal approval for retrofits. It was small.
Victory of institutional pragmatism. Public recognition came slowly. An article credited a generic mechanic in an unnamed bomber group, and the men grumbled at the lack of credit but felt consolation in the lives saved. 6 months after the first risky installation, the Wild Mirror had become institutionalized in a variant kit supplied to forward maintenance depots. The kit came with stamped plates and an installation guide and was no longer a whispered secret in the hangars. Colonel Fenwick retired, and later, in a private letter, confessed that he had been forced to choose between doctrine and the men under his command and had chosen them. Michael, after a quiet series of commendations, asked for reassignment to a training squadron. He did not want medals, he said, merely the chance to teach others to look, to improvise, and to respect the lives they protected. In time, he returned to Camden, sat in his father's garage and taught teenage boys how to solder and measure angles and to see opportunities where others saw rules. The legacy was not a single citation, but a chain of saved faces and later improvements that would incorporate the idea into turret design thinking. The legal and ethical debate lingered long after the hardware reached standardization. Some argued that breaking regulation, even with good results, set a dangerous precedent. Others that the rigid application of rules in crisis cost lives. The committee that reviewed similar innovations later issued guidance that allowed emergency field modifications under strict reporting and retrospective testing conditions. That procedural change opened a cautious path for future improvised solutions while still preserving engineering oversight. The moral calculus that Michael and his colleagues navigated became a case study in balancing initiative with accountability. Looking back, the human story mattered as much as the numbers. Men and women in distant bays who had rubbed their hands against cold metal and listened to the whine of warnings felt a small relief when they learned that a fellow enlisted man had taken a risk.
Letters returned to families, maintenance logs carried a note and a smudge of grease where a mirror had been fastened, and in reunions decades later, former crew members would point at a yellowed photograph and say quietly that a small piece of glass had made the difference between a life and a name on a roll. The official record preserved the performance metrics. The wing reported a tripling of accurate firing early in engagements, the adoption across 3 theaters, and the saving of hundreds of aircrew casualties. But the oral histories preserved gestures: a mechanic passing a clamp, a gunner whispering thanks, a pilot folding his hands and never speaking of the risk. In the end, the most resonant lesson was simple. Rules are designed for predictable problems, and war is a series of unpredictable ones. The Wild Mirror did not replace engineering. It bought time for better design, and it forced institutions to listen to the people who carried the immediate risk. Michael Raines returned home with hands that never stopped smelling of oil and a quiet sense that he had done what he could. At a small reunion in 1968, Fox Donovan held up a small tarnished bracket and said, "You kept us alive." That bracket now rests in a museum drawer, but the memory lives in the way crews adapt and in the policies that now have space for field innovation under supervision. Because sometimes the best inventions arrive when someone decides that rules are subordinate to life. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing and joining a community that remembers the quiet decisions that shaped conflict and saved people.